Hello and welcome to the State of Shakespeare. I'm Garrett Vandermeer.
And I'm Jim Elliott.
And today we're joined by Paul Alan Ruben. Hello,
Hey,
Paul.
How are you? Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks for joining us. And we're joined by Scott Brick. Hello, Scott.
Hello to you both. It's great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Wow, listen to that deep, sonorous resonance.
Yeah.
Hey, you got some pipes yourself, pal. Both of you.
Well, Jim, why don't you tell us about Paul and I'll follow up and tell our audience a little bit about Scott.
Excellent. Well, briefly, Paul Alan Ruben is the winner of 2 Grammy Awards for Best Spoken Word. Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them by Al Franken and Always Looking Up by Michael J. Fox. Paul has produced and directed multiple award-winning audiobooks and continues to teach storytelling to emerging and professional narrators in New York City and across the country. His current project, The Tragedy of Macbeth, which Paul directed for Dreamscape Audio, was released on March 18, 2021. The play features 10 actor audiobook narrators, including some of our industry's most notable performers, including Mr. Scott Brick.
I think that's my cue, isn't it? We're also joined by Scott Brick, who is an actor, writer, and award-winning audiobook narrator. Scott was hailed by Audible in 2012 as their most prolific narrator. Brick has narrated almost 900 audiobooks and was induced into the Audible Narrators.
Inducted?
Did I say induced?
Yes.
I am. Okay. It's good that we're talking to audiobook professionals because maybe we can get some pointers. Scott was inducted into the Audible Narrators Hall of Fame in 2018. So welcome to you both.
It's wonderful
Really,
to be
really
here.
happy to be here.
Yeah.
So all of the other projects you've worked on, Paul, have been, non-Shakespearean. So what got Macbeth into your head?
Macbeth didn't really get into my head to the degree that I was talking to Dreamscape Audio, and they had said to me, we're going to do Macbeth. Would you like to direct it? And I said, yes. I said, if you allow me to cast the program, the play, yes, I would like to direct it. And so I promptly called up the best narrators that I could think of, many of whom I know, including Scott. And that was how I came to be doing Macbeth. And yes, this is the first Shakespearean play I have ever directed.
Wow. When was the last time you had actually even interfaced with Shakespeare?
Well, my background is as a theater director, and I studied theater. I've been in theater my whole life. Now you're as we speak, a little frozen, which works for me as long as you can hear me.
I think I'm getting you.
Okay. That's how I like actually actors to work with me, is just when I talk, they freeze. And that always helps a lot. Scott's very good at that.
It's funny because it's true.
So I have seen multiple Shakespearean plays. I've read them. And in fact, I didn't feel particularly unsettled by that, because at the end of the day, for me, there is, in a very particular way, no difference between Shakespeare and any other play that you could think of.
So when I first hear audio-only production of Macbeth, I'm picturing 10 actors in a room with music stands and one choir mic in the center and reading the play from start to finish and recording it, and you're done. I have a feeling that this project was a bit different from the way I imagine it.
Wouldn't I have loved that? I would have. Have you heard of COVID-19? So I was compelled essentially to work with all 10 actors separately, each in their own home studio. So full disclosure, I did have Scott and Lady Macbeth together, each in their own home studio. But of course, all their other dialogue with everybody else had to be done wild.
So this was totally asynchronous, or almost totally asynchronous recording?
It was, if you will, asynchronous, and it was done in that sense like a movie, out of order. In fact, the first person that I worked with was a wonderful actor and narrator named Simon Vance, and Simon will be the first to tell you that he's almost as good as Scott. And Simon will shoot me now. So and So he was Macduff, and he was the first person I worked with.
Well, this begs the question of Scott. Scott, how was it working on a theater piece where so much of the interplay is between two characters and their dialogue, and not having that?
I tell you, it was definitely a challenge. It's certainly not the way that we've all grown accustomed to doing multi-voice recordings over the years. My first one was about 10 years ago, and we had it was a reading of Joan of Arc, and Ed Herman is there, and Christopher Tabori is there, and all these, and Amy Irving was there, and I'm like, oh my God, this is marvelous. And then yes, we were all in the same room going through it at the same time. And then occasionally you would have scenes that would be done out of order. This was all isolated. And Paul was extremely generous with his time. We all had a table read, which was wonderful. There was 10 different tables, of course.
Exactly.
But at least we got to hear what one another's takes on the character. And I thought that was vital. Before any of us went down and laid down any tracks at all, we got to hear each other's approach to these characters. I got to hear Simon as Macduff, and Dion as Banquo, and Kathe as Lady Macbeth. And I said to Paul, is it possible that, because come on, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, they have so much interplay. And I said, can we do it? And we, all three of us, Paul, Kathe, and I, we got on a Zoom call, and we could at least hear one another. Even though we were recording in separate locations, we were reading to one another. And we tried to do the same thing with Banquo, because most of Macbeth's other scenes, when it's not Lady Macbeth, he's with Banquo, till things go horribly, horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And Paul was very generous. He had already worked with Dion, and I said, could you give me 10, 15 minutes, like before each scene, I would listen to Dion's performance, because you don't know how hot to come in sometimes. You don't know how subtle you can be sometimes. And I think it was when I heard Dion, basically in that Macbeth's coming out party, when he's there in front of the court, and I heard Dion, how close to the microphone he was and how soft. He got in so close and says, "Thou hast it all now." And I thought, oh man, this is going to be great, But knowing that he was going to be that subtle, I knew that I could adjust my performance that much. So we were all isolated, but I was able to hear a lot of it before laying down these immortal lines. And I'm just so grateful. And I remember feeling so bad about keeping Paul waiting. Well, I didn't all that much. Paul, he's a pain in the tuchus, but he was nevertheless very generous with his time.
It makes me think about, like, Paul, for you, was there a lot of back and forth with the various scenes and the actors? Because it seems like the first person who reads it kind of dictates the scene unless there's a back and forth and there's adjustments made.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. So one of the great things about audio is, yes, in a play, if you're doing a play on stage, you have lots of rehearsal time. But once the play is up, it's up. So there was a lot of back and forth. And I must say, all the narrators were so patient with me. There were times when we did multiple takes of a line. 8, 9, 10 takes. And I think the reason from my perspective is the following. So yes, there was a lot of back and forth with everybody. Everybody was so generous to me. The only person who told me to be quiet was Scott, but otherwise everybody was wonderful.
Well, he wasn't Scott.
He was as generous as everybody in the ensemble. And what it permitted me to do as a director with Scott and with all the other actors was the following. I had suggested that in a very particular way, there's no difference between Macbeth and Sunday in the Park. And that's in this particular way. Despite the challenges of a play like Macbeth, the language, the verse, the vocabulary that you simply don't know and have to go look up, etc. And in fact, this may sound sort of silly, but how do you actually say "I will thither"? I mean, I wasn't there in 1500. How did they say that? So there's a lot of challenges that way. But at the end of the day, Macbeth was filled with spilkus. There was an enormous amount of emotional dissonance inside of this man, inside of this character. And so when you're directing Macbeth, ultimately what you're doing as a director is trying to work with the actor to organically connect to the character's feelings, and then in turn connect those feelings to the listener. And feelings, which is all that's actable, happy, sad, anxious, spilkus, exist in every play for all time, forever. And so in that very particular way, that's what I as a director spent, I would say, the majority of my time focusing on. P.S., real quick, I did an enormous amount of work for the first couple of weeks, went through it line by line by line by line to make sure that I understood it, because that's necessary. But it's one thing to see the play and say, yeah, I get it. And another thing to go line by line by line and say, do I really get this? Once that's done, then the rest is, as I suggested, working with the actors to emotionally connect. And I will say, and I mean it sincerely, what a joy and a privilege for me to work with actors like Scott and the other people in this play who do 95% of the heavy lifting and allow me to be a bit of a pain in the ass. I'm allowed to say that.
Did you just say a bit?
I did.
Oh,
Truth, I've always had trouble with the truth.
Bit or big?
All right. I think we can take that as written, both.
Well, it's interesting because you say about the emotionality of the words, and certainly, in Shakespeare's day, it was an oral sensation that they were going for, right? They didn't have as much of the visual business that we have in our theater today. So you mentioned in one of your pre-questions that the words can create 1,000 pictures in the mind's eye. And if there's any text that will do that, it's Shakespeare's text. He's writing for that. Scott, do you find a difference in performing Shakespeare and the imagistic language that he has versus doing something like, let's say Raymond Carver,
right? Yes, which I did 20 minutes ago.
Slightly different form. Yeah.
Right. No, to be honest, although the text is heightened, I think is how we referred to it back when I was in college. I actually think it was instrumental in helping me get started in audiobooks. But I did 10 years as a traveling Shakespearean actor. We worked out of the Music Center here in Los Angeles and touring all over California. And I was struck by Ron Marasco. He was a graduate acting student when I was at UCLA as an undergrad. And I'll never forget watching Ron talk about, I think he was doing the speech by Edmund, Why Bastard, Wherefore Base. And I was struck by the way that he did it. He just launched into it. And he pulled out a cigarette and he just started tapping it, the way that you tamp down the tobacco. He tapped it just to kind of accentuate the lines. And then, he lit it. And I'll never forget, he puts it in his mouth and says, why bastard? Wherefore base? And it was just the most conversational thing in the world. And I realized, I think that's the disconnect, is that we're looking at this as archaic language, but it was how they spoke at the time. And I just try to put myself in the same way that if I'm doing an Isaac Asimov book written in the 30s or 40s, a Ray Bradbury piece from the 1950s, these were very much of their time. You just have to change your headspace, okay, this is how we talk now. And it's the same emotions. They're just organized a little differently, and it's absolutely lovely. I can't tell you what it felt like getting the email from Paul saying, "Any interest in playing Macbeth?" Yeah, let me think about that for a nanosecond.
Yeah.
May I underline something Scott said?
Yeah.
In less than 30 seconds.
Oh yeah.
He had suggested that the words may be different, the syntax, etc., but the feelings are the feelings. And so, yes, it is challenging to play Macbeth, to be able to speak that language, which is in effect a little archaic for us. That said, the real challenge is to be able to stay connected to the feelings while speaking that archaic language. Yeah. Easier said than done. And so that was a challenge for me, for all of us.
Paul, I have a question for you. You mentioned that one of the most challenging things to direct, character to direct in this show was the witches. I'm curious why that was.
Each of the other characters, major characters, and even some of the minor characters in Macbeth, if you asked me to identify in a given scene how they were feeling, I could do it. I could identify how Macbeth was feeling most of the time. Big time Spilkus. I get that. I could identify how Lady Macbeth was feeling and so on and so forth. If you asked me, even in the first scene, to look at the witches, and you said to me, what's the feeling? What are these witches feeling? I'm not 100% sure I could clearly answer that question, and would certainly be curious to hear what other people would say. And in order for me to assess what the witches are feeling, I need to give back what the text is giving me. I need to see it embedded in the subtext. Yes? I look at the witches and I look at what the witches are saying and doing. I asked myself, okay, what's the feeling? And so here's why I asked that question. I asked it because if I can't identify the feeling, I am liable to play these witches stereotypically in a way that sort of indicates, to use the acting parlance, what I think a witch must sound like. Mm-hmm. And so I asked myself, what does a witch sound like? I asked the three women who played the witches, and I said to them, so let's not go there. Let's look at the text and see what we can see in terms of the subtext that helps us identify how these witches are feeling. And what I came up with, and what they pretty much came up with too, was the following. What I saw was the witches primarily, if you look at their dialogue, seemed very much to be enamored with messing people up, hurting them, making their lives really, really uncomfortable. And that seemed to turn them on. So I said to the women who played the witches, I said, see if you can translate that into a feeling. How does it feel to want to just mess up somebody? It means essentially you don't like them. You may not be angry at them, but you have no use for them. Let that palpitate inside of you. And I said, and so we may see what people say, but I don't want to do the stereotypical witch. Boil. Yeah. And so as a consequence, we didn't do that. And I got a teeny little bit of from the witches, just a little more character voice. But pretty much I stayed away from it. And very lastly, another reason is simply this. I would argue two things. Number one, the voice can't act. All it can do is make sound. If you essentially attempt to get the voice to act by talking like this, then by definition, what you'll get is something that indicates a feeling, but that is not organically there. So that was the challenge with the witches, and that's what I tried to stay away from and get them connected and rooted into a feeling so that they could then go out and do their bubble, boil, and trouble thing.
That's a really great answer. I like the idea of mischief makers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to challenge you on that, Paul. And I feel comfortable doing that because I'm in no danger of getting hired by you anytime ever. So
just to let you know, I don't feel comfortable because you could always press that off button.
And maybe challenge is not the right word, but in a situation where, as you say, you, the director, don't have any clear idea of what the feeling needs to be that's evoked. Mm-hmm. Is it your job to have that idea, or is it the actor's job?
Both. If in fact all that's actable is feeling, and I would argue the only thing Scott can act is the feeling. He can't act the words, he can't act the verse, and he can't act the poetry. That's what Bill does. Bill's responsible for that, not Scott. What Scott's responsible for is mining the subtext, mining the feelings inside those words. So as Scott and I and all the other actors collaborate, our job one, from my perspective, because Scott has other job ones too, but from my perspective, our collective job one is to be sure that A, we're mining the feeling, we're connecting to the feeling, and then B, giving back what the text gives us.
So how do you see your role as a director in that process?
I see my role the following way. If a given actor is narrating a line, so I'm going to exaggerate a little bit for you. Let's say, and it's Shakespeare, and let's say the actor says, yes, we must go yet down yonder to the blah, 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 like that. What I then hear is essentially the voice presenting a line. I then will often say to the actor, great, wonderful. What's the feeling? How does the character feel? Oh, well, he's happy, sad, etc., etc. Once we connect to that, I'll often ask the actor, okay, do that again, but don't help me with your voice. Less. Feel it, but don't help me. But does that make sense to you? Are you at least, am I communicating clearly?
Yes. Scott.
Yes, my approach to it has always been, because I teach audiobook narration. I've been working a great deal with Pat Fraley. I've been working with him teaching with him for 10 years now. So I always quote him. What we do is, it's a combination of techniques and truth. Although I'm completely in agreement with Paul, the voice cannot act. But there are things that we can do to our voice. Matter of fact, there are 6 characteristics that we could change. These are techniques that we can do. If somebody's described as their voice is rather dusty, or if it's really constricted and rather gravelly, okay, fine. We have to do that. But if you don't simultaneously wed it to the truth, the emotional truth of the scene, then it's there's that biblical line. It's like a clanging cymbal. It's an empty experience. If you just go with the technique and don't focus on the emotion behind it, then why are you wasting your time or mine or the listeners?
Where does intention come in? I mean, in acting, we talk about objectives and tactics and intention. Where does the intention come in, or does it?
I would ask you to just briefly explain what you mean by intention.
What you want, what the character's after.
Mm-hmm.
What's the
So
drive
I would
of the
argue
character?
that I would argue the following with any actor. If you talk about what you want, and you are quite right, there is no such thing as a play that is inhabited by characters that do not want anything. Macbeth is no exception. Every character wants something. We've only to listen to Lady Macbeth to really see it.
Mhm.
But every character does. So I would argue the following. Yes, you must know what you want, but strictly speaking, if I said to you, all right, act what you want, what would you do?
I would act how I go about getting what I want. So if
All
I
right, so
wanted
I
to
would
convince
argue
you, I might beg, I might plead, I might tickle, I might hammer away at you.
All right. Well, first of all, if you're looking at a script, you want to give back what the script gives you. So
Right.
if the book is telling you one thing, you have to stay there. At the end of the day, in a particular way, very reductive, you are going back down to simply saying, look, Jim, how do you feel? I know what you want, but how do you feel? Are you happy, sad, angry, anxious? It isn't that complicated. There aren't that many feelings. That's why everybody sees a shrink. None of us know how to even talk about our feelings. So once you are connected to that feeling, and once you are connected to the stakes, meaning how badly do you want it, I believe that in effect, at that point, you are so connected to the subtext, and I always tell actors this, that the subtext will direct you. You do not want to direct the subtext, which is in part what Scott's talking about. If the actor has a craggy voice, if you are not connected to the feeling and letting that feeling direct you, you are in effect letting the craggy voice direct. And all you're going to then get is indication. And it's going to be phony, false, silly, amateurish, etc. Lastly, one of the things the audio that I think was just a phenomenal plus, if you will, to be able to work with audio is Scott and all the other actors are 4 inches from the microphone or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so I often tell actors and narrators in particular, look at this intimate medium, translated less. Don't help me. Don't present it. Just feel it and connect yourself to it. And when you do, you will be moved and directed by the subtext, and there will be more nuance in your performance than is directable. So when I sit and listened at times to Scott and Kathe and the rest of the cast, all of them, I would think to myself, wow, I'm going to take credit for directing that, but I couldn't direct that if my life depended on it.
So I'm going to jump in here as the youngest member of this conversation.
Oh,
and
Garrett.
by extension,
But I'm only 17.
and therefore the least experienced, but probably most self-assured, and say that what seems to be emerging here is a difference in philosophy, perhaps between what Jim is talking about, the post-Stanislavski objective-oriented approach to acting and directing, and one that is primarily concerned with feelings. And I would say probably that the most important thing is to use whatever technique, philosophy, or verbiage allows you to help the actor eliminate barriers between what they're doing and the authentic truth, as efficiently and quickly as possible so that you can get what you need in the can and move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because with audiobook work and this play in particular, what you're suggesting is almost job one.
Yeah.
We don't have time to sit around for 2 weeks. And so for me,
Oh, yeah.
one of the challenges with Scott and everybody else in there is to do the following: give actable directions. And I think, again, if especially if students are listening, if they're student directors, very often an actor will not be able to translate a direction into that which is actable. It could be their problem. It could be because the direction itself isn't actable.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my challenge and part of what I've done for the last 25 years is to continue to try to train myself to give actable directions. So I'll give you an example. If I'm working with an actor, a good actor, sometimes I will hear a line that doesn't quite sound connected to me, to whatever the feeling is. And I will say to the actor, take him seriously. Take her seriously. And bang.
I remember one line in particular: I will not yield to kiss the ground at young Malcolm's feet. And Paul, he gave me that direction. What he just said, take this seriously. What does this mean? Just plant yourself in that mindset. You know, are you going to admit defeat? Are you going to give up? And he's like, I need more heat. I need it hotter. And I remember thinking, well, you know, I'm not reading this opposite Simon Vance. And you all know there's action and reaction. And I'm reacting to however Simon says, then yield, ye coward, you know. And I don't know how hot he's been. And so I even said that to him. I was like, Paul, I feel kind of inhibited. I want to take this line seriously, but I don't know how hot Simon gets. And Paul goes, yeah, he's pretty hot. I said, okay. And I just screamed, you know, I will not yield to kiss the ground at young Malcolm's feet. It's probably the hottest I've ever read a line in front of a microphone in my career, in mumble years. But, you know, Paul gave me that freedom and that marvelous direction, that insightful direction. Take this freaking seriously. This is do or die, literally. This is the moment.
I love it. That's such a fantastic story.
I tell you, audio gives you an opportunity that we don't get on stage or in front of the camera. Garrett, I think this will be a familiar scenario to you. I was on the Froude Playhouse stage at UCLA. Michael Hackett is directing me, and I had never done anything in a theater this large. And Michael says to me, Scott, you're giving me marvelous screen acting. And I didn't understand it. I was 17 years old. So to illustrate it, he said, when you're in front of a camera, and he goes and he stands 6 feet away from me. He says, I'm where the camera is. You're reaching me. And it's wonderful. And then he goes out into the audience, into the back row of the Froude, and he says, but I need you to reach me back here. And from that point on, I thought, oh, this is the acting paradigm. Where do I need to reach? It's either 6 feet away or it's 60 or 600. But it was within a year or two of doing audiobooks that I realized, oh no, there's also right here.
Yeah.
You are literally whispering in people's ears at one point. And if I'm playing to 6 feet away, which I did when I first got into the industry, I was playing 6 feet away, but I needed to play 6 inches away. And when you understand that there are subtleties that afford you opportunities, the subtlety of the storytelling medium in audiobooks gives you that opportunity for subtlety, then it's a gift. Then you can hear Dion Graham say, thou hast it now, you know, and he doesn't need to do anything more than that.
I'm having so much fun with this conversation that if we go on much further, we're going to miss our chance to hear the excerpt that you selected to share with us.
Yeah, we would be remiss if we didn't take advantage of such an experienced audiobook voice actor and not hear him perform Shakespeare for us.
It is the famous speech from
Yes.
Scottish play.
Yes, indeed. And this has always been my favorite line from Macbeth. To me, it's what I love about Shakespeare is that he comes back to certain issues, right? And he'll have two takes on a similar idea. What I love about this particular speech is that it's a wonderful counterpoint to the famous monologue from As You Like It. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. But in that, he takes a good long time to go through the 7 stages of a person's life. And in this, it's just bitter, and it's hurt, and it's regret, and it's just sad, sad, sad. And it's from Act 5, when it's right before he's told that Birnam Wood has come to Dunsinane, and he's basically saying, I have nothing to fear. I scoff at fear. And then somebody comes in and says, the queen, my lord, is dead. And he says, she should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
It's beautiful reading.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I get emotional every time I think about that scene.
Me too, though.
It's we were talking about intention. Jim, you talked about that earlier, and what does the character want? I ask myself two things. What does this character need? No, but first thing I ask is, what does the character want? And then I ask, what does the character need? Because they're not always the same thing. And I think something that I've always thought was overlooked about Macbeth is he wants to rule. He wants to succeed. He wants to make his wife happy. But I think he needs to feel better about himself. There's a horror that goes on when he realizes he's capable of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And he just desperately needs to know that he's a better man than he is. And it's to me, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
As we see when things
Tough
go
to get out of that
horribly
shame
wrong.
cycle once you get into it.
Yeah, it is. That line, she should have died another time. She should have died later. I mean, it's like the entirety of Hamlet summed up in one line. I mean,
I think that's such a beautiful place to leave it.
Real quick, if
Please.
I can say in 25 seconds or less, I think too that regardless of how anybody would assess the performance, despite all of the challenges that we had, I think the way Scott did that and what he showed us is an expression of one of the advantages that audio only has.
So for our listeners who would like to enjoy this production in its entirety, where will they go?
Well, if I was them, I would go to probably Audible, and hopefully they have they're signed up with Audible and they can download the program directly from Audible. They could, if they wanted to, order the CD version.
when they do, the important thing, a lot of people will only type in Macbeth. If you search under The Tragedy of Macbeth, you'll find it much sooner. And,
Thank you for that.
Yeah, out recently.
So I think we got that in the can. Oh boy, you guys, this was a really
was
delightful
awesome.
conversation. I had a great time.
Oh, for me as
to
well.
you.
Yeah, me too. This
Me
is. I
too.
mean, I was looking forward to it, but I mean, I was like, damn, I didn't know it was gonna be this fun.
Well, Scott Brick and Paul Alan Ruben, thank you so much for spending time talking with us today. We're so excited about this production and can't wait to check it out for ourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us. It's
Thank you
it's
both.
a privilege. Thank you both.
I'm Garrett Vandermeer,
And I'm Jim Elliott.
and thank you for listening to The State of Shakespeare.
It's fun to work on a play where essentially every scene feels like someone's hand is on the juggler of the characters that are in it.
Yeah.
I mean, the only scene that really you don't feel that is, the drunk, Johnny's scene when he plays the
Right.
drunk.
Yeah, the porter.
The porter.
The porter, yeah.
That was just so extraordinary. In one sense, working with Scott and Kathe, I can remember thinking, we took a little break, or somebody was talking, and I thought, oh man, this is so much fun, but gee, these guys ever let up? I mean, do I get a break? I mean, do they look at each other and say, oh man, you know what? I got the roast on, and could you go get the? So
No,
of
it's
course I
true.
know that's not possible. And so I think for an actor, I won't speak for Scott, but certainly for me as a director, this is like steroids. It's just, it just doesn't get any better.
I could not agree more. It's like, look, this is his shortest play, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the power of it, is that you're running at breakneck speed. And it's like Shakespeare realized, okay, I got my opponent on the ground. I ain't taking my foot off the back of his neck. And he's just he's just going for blood the whole time.
Yeah.
And the stakes are so high. The stakes are always right up here,
It's
right here for the whole
juggler.
freaking thing. Oh, it's extraordinary. There's a
At least.
really gifted narrator, Alex Hyde-White. And when he was starting out, he took a class with me. And Alex, he has had a distinguished narration career. And I had been teaching the 8 ways that we create emphasis. And the reason that I do this is because people see an exclamation mark and they get louder. That doesn't mean volume. It just means emphasis. And we have 8 ways that we can emphasize things. So I'm leading people through them. That's going faster or slower. It's pitch higher or lower, pausing before, pausing after, and it's volume higher or lower. And I was going through these. And anyway, Alex he's narrating from a biography of Truman Capote. And in it, I don't remember who the character is, but there was somebody in Capote's life that he called Big Mom. And there's a scene, and Alex is in the booth, right? We got the door closed. He can't hear what anybody does or says out here. But essentially, he says, Big Mama said, "I love you, Truman." And Truman says, "No, you don't, Big Mama." "No, Truman, I do love you." "No, Big Mama, you can't love me." "Truman, why would you say that I can't love you?" "Because I don't deserve to be loved, Big Mama." And it was like every person in that room, it was like we'd all been kicked in the gut. And I got on the talk back. And I said, "I want to ask you something. You used 3 of the techniques for emphasis. Did you go into that line? Were you planning on pausing before you said it and dropping your volume and dropping a pitch?" And he goes, "I didn't think about any of those." I said, "Well, what did you think about, if you don't mind?" He said, "I thought of all the times in my life when I felt like I didn't deserve to be loved." And I said, "Well, you didn't hear it, but I can tell you, because I was out here, that the moment you connected to the text, everybody in this room connected to you, and through you to the text as well."
Well, if I can, Scott, and I didn't plan this, but for me, what Scott's suggesting is exactly what I am talking about when I say you have to let the subtext direct you. And I would argue that if Scott had broken that down and said, "Okay, I'm going to try to recreate that," it would have been basically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So when the actor is connected and when the subtext is driving him, I would have bet, all $9 that I have in the bank that of course he didn't plan that, because if he planned it, you would have known it. It might have worked okay, but it wouldn't have blown everybody's brains out.
All he did was he married those techniques. He did them instinctively by just focusing on the truth.
So Jim and I are going to start a new podcast, and it's going to be called Masterclass. And what we're going to do is we're going to surreptitiously record everything after we say, "Thank you for listening to the State of Shakespeare."
Right.
And
hey, man.
And we're just going to publish all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Why not?